My name's Daniel Botsman. I teach in the history department here at Yale. And it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome you all today to Yale's 23rd annual John W. Hall Lecture in Japanese Studies. As explained in these pamphlets that hopefully you've all received, the whole series was established in 1999 with the generous support of Mrs. Robin Hall, to honor the memory of her husband, John W. Hall, who was, of course, one of the most important figures in the development of Japanese studies in the decades following World War II. Professor Hall was a historian, primarily of pre-modern Japan, who completed his PhD dissertation at Harvard, writing about Tanuma Okitsugu, one of the important political figures of the 18th century in Japan. And he wrote the dissertation under the direction of Edwin O. Reischauer. He then began his scholarly career at the University of Michigan in 1949 before moving to Yale in 1961 as the A. Whitney Griswold Professor of History. As a scholar, he played a critical role in opening the study of pre-modern Japanese history to the English-speaking world with a slew of important works, including, most importantly, perhaps his 1966 monograph, Government and Local Power in Japan, 500 to 1700. He also, of course, edited the original Cambridge History of Japan volumes, an enduring contribution to the field, which is only now in the process of being updated. For all of his deep engagement with the past, he was also very much an institution builder, strongly committed to the work of facilitating the scholarship of the future. At Yale, he was chair of the history department and of the Council on East Asian Studies. He was also master, as it was then known, of Morse College, and he trained a generation of graduate students here who went on to reshape the field, including figures such as Hal Bolitho, Jeffrey Mass, James McLean, and Suzanne Gay. Outside of Yale, he played a central role in building the institutional structures that have supported the study of Japan and Asia more generally ever since, including the Association for Asian Studies, for example. Each year then, with the exception, I will say, of 2020-21, we took a little COVID break, Yale's current faculty have the privilege of extending to an eminent scholar of Japan an invitation to deliver the Hall Lecture. And we're extremely fortunate this year to have been able to convince Professor Richard J. Samuels, Ford International Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to travel to the wilds of New Haven to speak to us all today. I can honestly think of no active scholar in any discipline better qualified to deliver the Hall Lecture in Japanese studies. He is a towering figure, and I don't mean just because he's actually, like me, quite tall, and a former basketball player, although that is also true. Professor Samuels was born in Brooklyn and grew up just across the Sound on Long Island. While in high school, he met his wife, Deborah, who we're also extremely pleased to be able to welcome to New Haven. Hi, welcome, Deborah. If you're not already familiar with them, I would recommend Deborah Samuels' Japanese and Korean cookbooks, which I think are among the very best available to introduce those cuisines to people in English. And I hope you won't mind me saying that as college students, they went to Japan together for the first time to Kyushu, which is a place that I know some people here have a special connection to also. And then after that initial experience, Professor Samuels went on to complete an MA at Tufts, and then his PhD at MIT, where he has, of course, gone on to build an illustrious career. Like John W. Hall, Professor Samuels is very much an institution builder who has held many significant leadership roles, not only at MIT, where he has served in many important roles, including as the director of the Center for International Studies, but also in numerous organizations responsible for stewarding different aspects of US-Japan relations in particular, including the Japan-US Friendship Commission, the Japan Committee of the National Research Council, and the US-Japan Conference on Cultural and Educational Interchange. The contributions are, of course, these contributions are, of course, more than matched by his achievements as a scholar. In the age of Wikipedia, and indeed ChatGPT, there is, I think, no need for me to list all of Professor Samuel's important publications. I suspect ChatGPT might add a few creative ones. But given the occasion, it would be remiss of me not to mention that his 1994 book, Rich Nation, Strong Army, National Security and the Technological Transformation of Japan, was recipient of the John W. Hall Prize from the Association of Asian Studies for Best Book in the Field of Japanese Studies, among other distinguished prizes. More generally, let me say that in an era in which all disciplines seem to battle with the curse of over-specialization, Professor Samuel's corpus of scholarly work speaks not just across subfields, but across disciplines. I certainly think it's true that there's no Japan political scientist whose work is assigned in history classes as often as those of Professor Samuel's. And part of the reason for that is simply that he always takes on topics of clear and obvious importance. Think, for example, of his books on 311 or on Japanese grand strategy. For all of the seriousness with which Professor Samuels engages the specificities of Japan's political culture, moreover, he's equally someone who thinks broadly and comparatively, as perhaps most obviously evidenced by his path-breaking comparative study of political leaders in Japan and Italy, Machiavelli's Children. Professor Samuels is also a wordsmith of unusual skill and talent, whose books are replete with sentences that make you smile as well as think, and which are full of smaller treasures of wisdom as well as compelling answers to large questions. Finally, let me say that Professor Samuel's work is characterized not only by a refusal to pull punches, but also by a level of honesty and integrity which commands respect even from those who might disagree or take very different stances on key political questions. His most recent book, Special Duty, A History of the Japanese Intelligence Community, provides an excellent example of this. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been forced to rethink their own preconceptions about issues such as the controversial 2013 designated states secret, sorry, I knew I was going to stumble on this, designated states secret law as a result of reading that wonderful book. I've gone on much too long, I know, but I hope some of what I've said will help you understand why I am really excited to hear Professor Samuel's lecture today, and I hope that you will now join with me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks very much, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor, really, to address you this afternoon, not least because the lecture series pays tribute to one of the nation's and Yale's most distinguished Japan specialist, John Whitney Hall. Now, I'll be speaking about Japan's response to its security environment this afternoon, and it's a topic I suspect that Professor Hall would have found of interest in a different security environment, but it would certainly have found of interest. But before I go there, I want to reflect a bit on what brought me to this topic, and to connect the journey to my mentor, Lucian Pai. Steve, Lucian was still around when you were, right? Okay, good. You'll enjoy this, I hope. He earned his PhD here at Yale, so it's not entirely inappropriate. For Lucian's Festschrift, my co-editor, Myron Weiner, and I asked each of our authors to, they were all comparativists of one stripe or another, we asked them to reflect on the political culture of foreign area studies. Why do some comparativists pick certain topics and not others, and what's the political culture that what are they bathing in? Our presumption was that Lucian would have been very comfortable with that, namely that there are academic norms and academic values that stimulate and perhaps legitimate some inquiry and preclude others. And Lucian was very comfortable with that. It turned out a very easy case to make. It was quite clear that the circumstances of foreign politics that they shape our research agendas. That was not a hard thing to discover. One obvious example from the Festschrift session was made by one of Lucian's former students, who was a specialist on Soviet politics, and who explained to an understanding audience that some of the best, that the Soviet politics contributed very little to the literature on political participation. But another was that some of the best conceptual work on social movements and ethnicity came from the study of South Asia. Again, this all made perfect sense. But as I dug into the Japanese case, it was less obvious why, with the notable exception of Chalmers Johnson and maybe Ronald Dorr, Japanists contributed so little to political, economic, or social theory. And why were we, I wondered, theory takers and not theory makers? Why didn't we do what specialists in other fields of comparative inquiry did? Was it something about us as Japan scholars? Or was it something about Japan? And it was a few short steps from those questions that led to a larger one. Had we somehow been captured? Were we a captured intelligentsia? And if so, who was our captor? Were we slaves to convention, or perhaps to politics? And if it's the latter, did we serve our own sovereign? It was politics that was driving us. This is something that John Dower, another great Japan specialist and a colleague of mine at MIT, he once charged that. Or is it because we were captives to a foreign sovereign, as the so-called Japan bashers of the 80s and 90s suggested? Did the considerable resources that were made available to Japan specialists by Japanese sources dampen our enthusiasm to say critical things about Japan? Did the resources that were made available to us by the US government dampen our enthusiasm to criticize the United States? In short, I found it with no small regret that for decades, on both sides of the Pacific War, the political culture of Japanese political studies in the United States had corresponded much more directly to the ebbs and flows of bilateral relations with Japan between Japan and the United States than to the unfettered intellectual curiosity of those of us who were studying and our predecessors who were studying the topic. That is, Japanese political studies had lurched from one to another intellectual fashion, and we likely missed a lot in the process. I know I did. I missed a lot, and I'll get to that point immediately. So let me indulge in sort of a personal account, because it wasn't until 30 years after Lucian's Festschrift was published, it was 2 decades after I wrote Rich Nation, Strong Army, that Danny referred to, and at least 7 to 8 years after Securing Japan, the book on Japan's grand strategy, came out, that I realized that I had written two books about Japanese national security without interrogating 2 of the most important topics of that domain. Completely ignored how Japan does intelligence, and I completely ignored in those 2 studies the prospects for Japan's nuclear breakout and acquisition of nuclear weapons. And indeed, in The Business of the Japanese State, an earlier book that was not on national security per se, it had a very fat chapter on nuclear power and the history of the nuclear power industry in Japan, without ever once my exploring what Japan was planning to do with all that plutonium that it was producing, or why it needed to have basically a full cycle nuclear capability. So about a decade ago, when it hit me that I had missed all that stuff, I began to wonder why I had failed to address those topics and why no one pointed it out to me. And I noticed that virtually no one else had tackled those issues either, which is consistent with the point I was starting with here with you. So I've spent the last decade trying to backfill both topics. And that brings me back to Lucian Pye. I wrote a piece recently for a really interesting volume that was edited by Connie Ryer and Nora Kottman in Germany. And as I told a group at Columbia earlier, late last year, that and Charlie knows this well, he was there, when passing graduate students in the hallway, Lucian used to stop the students and ask, invariably, "Are you being brave, scholar? Are you being brave?" And we would all, nonplussed, not know exactly how to respond to such a question. It seemed bizarre to us at the time. And we all smiled and we walked on. But I have never forgotten the question. And I realize now that he wasn't joking. You need to be brave. Because brave, and now certainly brave means many things, but it appears as a choice in one form or another at nearly every stage of a major project in what we do as academics. Starting with our choice of dissertation topics. But it's easier to hew, it seems to me, to disciplinary norms and to take on subjects that have already been validated by our mentors and our peers than it is to get out ahead of the subfield or even the discipline. And that's been especially the problem in Japanese studies, it seems to me. But in the current issue of the Texas National Security Review, a former colleague of ours at MIT, Frank Gavin, speaks directly to this issue. And I want to just quote him. "The public-minded scholar is obliged to disturb the status quo. She should complicate stylized narrative, undermine the conventional wisdom, make people uncomfortable, and most of all, force them to challenge the assumptions and to think." And we all know how to review an existing literature. We know how to identify a narrow niche in which to drill down for new information. We spend a lot of time in graduate school learning how to search for and apply other people's models. We answer other people's questions, but it's much more difficult and much more risky to formulate new questions and explore the previously unexplored in new ways, and we often fail, and I have often failed to do that. So Lucian's brave scholars attempt to hack through the undergrowth of difficult problems with new tools, and especially with new questions, important questions. This is difficult, and it's also risky, and as Gavin points out, also very unpopular. You don't get to go to the garden parties quite as often. And the risks are greater when the problem's tougher or when the conventional wisdom is thicker, because taking risks involves breaking China. It's a small c, breaking China. I'm not here to warmonger, but this is because there were rules and norms in every field. Again, this is back to that Festschrift. And not least of all in Japanese studies, where rule number one is decorum. Polite, be polite. Observing decorum may not be difficult, but it does constrain creativity, it seems to me. In my own case, this challenge was most clearly manifest when I asked my Todai Onshi, my professor at Tokyo University, for an affiliation with his new research center. I was doing Rich Nations, what turned into Rich Nations Strong Army, and I wanted to go where the cutting edge of work was being done in Japan, and it was in his center. And he declined. He said, "No, you can't affiliate with us." Because he said my topic was something he had organized an important study group on, which I knew of. He said it was too sensitive. And ue wa noto, the guys upstairs, meaning the bureaucracy, wouldn't be comfortable with it. And then after situating myself elsewhere, I asked for a copy of the group's report, and he didn't provide it. And since I had followed all the decorous rules of Japanese studies, the aisatsu, the nengajo, the gift exchanges, and the more substantive accommodations over many years, and since he was supposed to be an academic, I thought we were in the same business. I was shocked. In the event, I wrote the book I wanted to write, and it won several prizes, as Danny kindly said, including the John Whitney Hall Prize, which was lovely. But I found myself excluded from a range of activities, for at least a decade. And so Lucian Pye's injunction to be brave, which I never saw myself as understanding before, stayed in my head. And it's still there. There are still a lot of questions we have not thought to ask for a variety of reasons, some of which I've tried to outline here in my introductory remarks. But this is even more important, it seems to me, when, as in political science, methods are getting more, at least I can speak to political science, methods are getting more attention than substance in some cases. So let's turn to substance, if we can. Actually, what was on the poster is the substance that I want to talk about. I think that students of national security who were born after the Asia-Pacific War find it particularly difficult to suspend disbelief about the prospects for war and peace in contemporary Asia, particularly contemporary Japan. And that's what I'd like to discuss this afternoon, not least because the views of Japan's leaders in Japanese public opinion have clearly shifted in the last decade or two. The way scholars of international relations get at this is to work paradigmatically. This is old stuff to many of you, but it's just useful as a way in, which is to talk about the paradigms very, very briefly. So I apologize in advance for oversimplifying, but let me just suggest that the constructivist, the liberal, and the realist perspectives have each had their day in Japan's post-war journey to the present. And by the present, I'm referring to the most recent announcement of Japan's new national security strategy, which was just in December. And I'll just refer to it going forward now as the NSS, National Security Strategy. So let me start by flicking at each of these three paradigms just to frame the route Tokyo has taken vis-a-vis the alliance with the United States. And I'll start with the constructivist notion that to some, post-war Japan has been pacifist as a matter of national identity. After the war, you're familiar with how Article 9 stipulates that Japan will not maintain land, sea, or air forces, and you are no doubt familiar with how decades of so-called anti-militarist public opinion was shaped by the ghosts of militarist past. And this is not untrue. This constructivist notion does explain a lot of that, I think. I sometimes refer to the shroud of Yamagata Aritomo, trying to get Japan away from militarist past. And pacifism, of course, was enshrined in law and declared to be Japan's national identity, at least after 1945. An anti-militarist identity was invoked to constrain any Japanese military capabilities, particularly offensive ones, like missiles and carriers and airborne refueling and things like that. The identity also included so-called nuclear allergy, which made it impossible to even imagine. This is where I fell down. It made it impossible to even imagine Japan having thought about, in the acquisition of nuclear power, nuclear weapons. But it did. We now know that. And they talk about it openly now. But this identity also included, as I say, the nuclear allergy, a ban on arms exports, an undersized intelligence capability, and a prohibition on the military use of space. It seemed that as a result, for 5 decades or so after the Asia-Pacific War, any serious discussion of national security was a dangerous third rail for an ambitious Japanese political candidate. Now, what I want to do is just shift over slightly and connect this idea into the liberal paradigm so we can interrogate this identity more closely. As you know, Japanese conservatives have governed Japan virtually without a break since the end of the US occupation. It's well understood that this conservative camp, it's less well understood that this conservative camp was never monolithic. And for most of the second half of the 20th century, Japan followed the preferences of its greatest post-war statesman, which was Yoshida Shigeru. The LDP was dominated by his wing of the party, which was a very pragmatic wing the LDP, the liberal. He was not in the LDP. He left politics before the LDP was formed in November of 1955. But his school really governed, for the most part, for the next 20, 30 years. The Yoshida Doctrine, his idea about national security was brilliant politically. It sustained the pragmatist power and, for the most part, kept military realists, who I'll get to in a moment, at arm's length. Japan constrained itself, self-imposed constraints, and sheltered under U.S. protection and invoked its pacifist identity. In doing so, it maneuvered cleverly to avoid entanglement in U.S. wars, and there were many of those. Now, it enabled Japan to get back on its feet without overextending itself through defense spending, a conscious choice. And it was a choice from a liberal perspective of interest groups fighting with one another about what will drive the engine of post-war reconstruction. Would it be defense, as the defense industry wanted with MITI, or would it be everything else, which is what the finance ministry wanted? It was everything else. It made economic rehabilitation Japan's priority. Japan would remain lightly armed and would avoid becoming too involved with international strategic affairs while taking advantage of U.S. security guarantees and getting rich from access to robust U.S. markets and technology. Now, politically, the greatest benefit was that the Japanese public and Japan's neighbors, both, would be reassured that Japan no longer posed a threat to them, to the home, or to the neighbors. In exchange, Japan would provide the United States forward bases. It still does. So Japan's cheap riding was in everyone's interests and became a blueprint for Japanese defense and foreign policy efforts for the next half century. Seen in this liberal view, it was not built on a national identity, rather on a political calculation. This was about domestic politics. And by the early 2000s, LDP pragmatists ran out of steam, it seems, and the party's nationalists gained momentum in their long and very erratic march to consolidating power and controlling Japan's foreign and security policies. And moreover, by this time, domestic squabbles within the LDP had been overtaken by marked shifts in Japan's security environment. A new world order was forming. So, given that it's a new world order and balances of power are changing, I mean, great segue to the realist paradigm. Even before the end of the Cold War, Japan had begun to salami slice away, piece by piece, slowly, the self-imposed constraints of the Yoshida Doctrine. In the 1980s, they extended the sea lanes of communication out, defense of the sea lanes of communication out 1,000 nautical miles. That's not terribly distant, but symbolically very important. In the 1990s, they sent minesweepers to the Persian Gulf after the conflict ended. But de facto, they had military use of space. By the 2000s, they were sending destroyers to escort tankers to Diego Garcia to fuel U.S. and British warplanes to fight Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. And the salami slicing simply accelerated. It really ramped up in the 2010s and into this decade. Collective self-defense became possible, reinterpretation of the Constitution to allow Japan's military to protect the American military should it come under fire and under other kinds of conditions, which we can talk about. But they built a naval facility in Djibouti for tens of millions of dollars. They loosened their arms export control ban, self-imposed. They created this new state secrets law that Danny referred to, that we all got exercised about and realized that was not such a terrible thing. Again, I felt the same way that he did as I got into it. Stood up a cyber command. They shifted to Southern Defense. They stood up a Marine Corps. A Marine Corps. That's an offensive capability last time I checked. And an open discussion of a nuclear deterrent. And I haven't even come to the current NSS yet, but I'm getting there. I promise you I am. By 2021, the shift in East Asia's balance of power had become very clear to most Japanese, and with that, so had the salience of national security in domestic Japanese politics. And that year, 2021, 3 of 4 candidates for the presidency of the LDP, and therefore for the prime ministership to succeed Suga-san. 3 of the 4 of them to be prime minister emphasized defense issues and said they were willing to raise the defense budget. I mean, this was heterodox beyond repair under earlier assumptions about Japan's pacifist national identity. And 3 of the 4 said they would do that, and the 4th one came in dead last. Okay, so this emboldened. It was a good reading, actually, of the of changes in public opinion as well. Clearly, Japanese public opinion on national security had shifted in the direction of broader, more realistic security discourse. And we should credit Abe Shinzo, Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister, with part of that. But of course, his government, that is Abe's government, as he was trying to push the Japanese public into a more realistic posture and appreciation for Japan's having a more realistic posture, had no little help from 2 provocative neighbors, North Korea and China, and as well as from Washington. And the help from Washington is counterintuitive. The help from Washington came from what many Japanese came to openly fear, was that the United States would simply not be as committed to defending Japan as it had been before China's rise, and especially before North Korea acquired intercontinental ballistic missiles. It changed everything, and so the confidence in the United States declined, especially with that first ICBM test by the North Koreans in 2017. And now, by last year, the majority of Japanese polled on these issues viewed China as a threat and the reported feeling, and this is a quote from the survey, that U.S. influence will weaken, unquote. Now, that's realism 101, in a sense. Japan is no longer driving its security bus with one foot on the brake. It's now become a realist in realist clothing. And this is a change. And what I want to talk about in the time I have left are 3 realist-oriented questions that are core to the U.S.-Japan alliance and to Japanese national security. The first is how far Japan would go to balance China. The second is how far Japan would go to defend Taiwan. And the third is, to what extent is Japan hedging against abandonment by the United States? Now, to answer these questions, it helps to provide, I think, more of a feel for the contours of Japan's security environment as articulated in the NSS. I told you I would get there. We're here. The new NSS, which is the first one in a decade, has attracted a great deal of attention. It's more blunt, it's more ambitious, and it's more muscular than anything that preceded it, and it's also occasionally as opaque as the many things that preceded it. But by far the most remarked upon innovation, let's call it, military innovation, is its authorization of a new standoff missile counterstrike capability. In making the case for counterstrike, which the NSS goes to great pains to insist is not in violation of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, nor Japan's principle of exclusively defensive defense, senshu-boei. It declares existing BMD, ballistic missile defense, and missile capabilities simply to be no longer sufficient to deter its adversaries. Its adversaries means China, North Korea. And to deter aggression, says the report. Less clear, though, is which missiles will be acquired. It looks like it's Tomahawks. And who will do the targeting, because Japan doesn't have sophisticated missile targeting capabilities yet. So this is especially problematic because it's, as I say, its C3I capabilities are too underdeveloped for the missiles to be credible as an autonomous deterrent yet. So that looks like the United States then plays a role. At least there are whispers that the United States military will help play a role in targeting. And close behind the counterstrike decision, in media ink spilled, the NSS now formally commits Japan to doubling its defense budget as a percent of GDP over the next 5 years. Now, it's not clear, though, how an underfunded government of Japan is going to pay for all this. That's a lot of money. And so the other thing to note is that there's considerable opposition inside the government, inside the LDP, the ruling party, to new taxes. They don't want to raise taxes for this. They don't want to raise taxes at all because they want to get reelected. And that's not irrational. But there's much speculation, therefore, that a lot of the spending, the doubling of the percentage of GDP, will not be new spending. So, for example, there's this wonderful prestigitation by which the Japan Coast Guard and some government-funded dual-use R&D budgets are now going to be swept into the defense budget. That takes care of a whole hunk of the increase in defense spending right there. Japan's Coast Guard is a non-trivial force. And it's not clear how Japan will spend whatever funding is actually new, like for the counter-strike capability. Now, third, the centrality of the alliance in the NSF was reaffirmed, and really earlier than the NSF was reaffirmed by both countries, even to the point of openly considering the use of combined forces in selected contingencies in Northeast Asia. The Biden administration loved that. They cheered when the NSS bluntly referred to China as this is a quote from the National Security Strategy, quote, the greatest strategic challenge to ensuring the peace and security of Japan and the international community. They pulled no punches. And some in Washington may have gone hoarse cheering. It's the statement in the NSF that Japan must respond to China's threats to the rule-based international order in cooperation with Washington and, quote, other like-minded countries. We'll get to those other like-minded countries in a moment, but it also speaks to the strategic use of overseas development assistance, aid, the strategic use of aid openly in the document, presumably in the form of increased transfers of military equipment to naval vessels, for example, and aircraft, to aligned states in Southeast Asia. And finally, we can see interesting changes in how Japan's signature interesting changes in Japan's signature concept of comprehensive security is characterized. Some of you, and I'm looking around the room, not many of you will remember that in the 1980s, Japanese strategists associated with Yoshida and the Yoshida Doctrine invented the term comprehensive security to justify low defense spending, because security included economics and trade and technology, and therefore we shouldn't spend so much money on the military. Very interesting concept. And they'd emphasize Japan's commitments to diplomacy and foreign economic policy, particularly energy policy. But today's NSS speaks instead to not comprehensive security, but to comprehensive national power. Not the same thing at all, and foregrounds the military alongside the intelligence community in Japan's national security toolkit. Now, all this said, there was one large, very large dog that didn't bark in any of this, and that's, of course, what I've referred to several times as a nuclear breakout. It didn't bark in the NSS, but it did bark after the Ukraine war started. Former Prime Minister Abe minced no words within 3 days, maybe 4, of the Russian aggression into Ukraine invasion. He called on the government to discuss the viability of nuclear sharing with the United States. He said, we should have that conversation. But Prime Minister Kishida, who, by the way, some of you will know, is from Hiroshima, he passed on this. And it's his NSS, after all, now, his strategy. It's his government strategy. His name is on it. And it states clearly that there will be no change to Japan's 3 non-nuclear principles. Japan is, and this is a direct quote from a really wonderful analysis by an Israeli analyst. He said, Japan is the most salient example in the world of nuclear hedging among global powers. And has already, as we know, openly embraced the deterrent benefits, as they see it, of nuclear latency, that is the nuclear hedge. Okay? In fact, a sitting Secretary of Defense talked about, after 3/11, the need to maintain nuclear power in order to have enough fuel and weapons-grade materials for nuclear weapons as a signal of latency. And that was as clear a statement as you can get. But the NSS, disingenuously, I thought, declared its commitment to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. So it's in that netherworld of, we could do this if we want to do it. We could talk about this in the Q&A, but we could do this if we want to do it. We have the technology, we have the equipment, we have the material, but we don't want to do it. Don't make us do it. But don't play with us because we could do it, and so forth. You get the idea. So nuclear armament, even if it's German-style nuclear sharing, has been left for another day. I don't think it's entirely, I can't imagine that it's entirely off the agenda if my reading of Japanese concern about American commitment and capabilities is correct. So from a realist perspective, nowhere is the shift of the regional balance of power in China's favor potentially more consequential for Japan than Taiwan. To get to that second issue I wanted to raise, which sits along the first island chain at a strategic choke point for naval forces in the Western Pacific and is critical to securing Japan's southern flank. Tokyo, very long cautious in offering overt support to Taiwan, issued a defense white paper in 2021 declaring that Japan will, quote, pay close attention to the Taiwan situation with a sense of crisis, unquote. And that was followed by a series of 2021-2022 trial balloons that were sent up by senior Japanese defense officials who proclaimed that Japan has to defend Taiwan, will have to defend Taiwan. I could give you the quotes, but for this, I won't go into them. They're all basically that message. So it wasn't a huge surprise that the NSS went bold on this. Although it declares there's no change to the 1972 Japan-China communique or to its relationship with Taiwan, the NSS stresses that Japan and Taiwan share values, quote unquote, and labels Taiwan, quote, an extremely important partner and dear friend. Now these developments are striking, but given that Japan has no treaty obligation to defend Taiwan, and given the economic stakes embedded in the China relationship, which are considerable, China is Japan's largest single trading partner, I guess that some Japanese prime ministers like Kishida would hesitate ordering the SDF to fight in support of US forces in a Taiwan contingency until or unless the Japanese civilians or soldiers fall to hostile fire. So we'll watch this space and remind ourselves that just a few years ago, even a general discussion of these shifts and plans would have ensured a government crumbling, thunderclap. This time, crickets. Crickets. Now this is possible for two not unrelated reasons. First, because the US foreign policy has been feeding an abandonment discourse. There's no other way to describe it. There's an abandonment discourse in Japan now for several years. And second, because the center of gravity of Japanese public opinion has shifted to the right. To test this, very crudely, I'm not known as a methodologist, but to test this very crudely, I took a quick look at how the ragged U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021 was connecting to the Japanese conversation about Taiwan and about a Taiwan contingency. And I found hundreds of thousands of links in a Japanese Google search to stories, links to stories asking questions like, will Taiwan be like Afghanistan? Will Japan also be abandoned by the United States? The American withdrawal from Afghanistan galvanized attention in Japan, and predictably, very predictably, the crisis in Ukraine further stimulated these concerns. So what was a low boil of concern about American commitment and capabilities and really happy talk among alliances at formal meetings like 2+2s and so forth? What was a low boil began to bubble really quite vigorously. And so when I did the same Google search, but after the Ukraine crisis began, Google returned twice the number of hits that it did on the Afghanistan question. And sifting through hundreds of them, it was clear to me that many Japanese were fretting about whether failed U.S. support for Ukraine might undermine extended deterrence in Northeast Asia. So let's take a look at this concern and take on that third question that I mentioned, which is, what is Japan doing about it by hedging? Japanese hedging is a classic realist question, but the blunt version is that while Japanese leaders know that the U.S. alliance is their best bet, there's no question about that, Tokyo has been nonetheless actively hedging for some time, and is doing so more actively these days with very broad public support, and ironically with U.S. encouragement. It's very interesting. The Russian invasion of Ukraine made it very easy for Japan's hedging-inclined realists. Just months ago, the chief of the ground self-defense forces, well, the former chief of the ground self-defense forces, the army, the Japanese army, made a very succinct case for the connection between the Ukraine war and further discussions of a nuclear weapons option. The former chief of the Japanese military. He said, quote, "The world learned from Ukraine that the United States will not intervene militarily in the event of a possible nuclear war. That we were deterred from getting in by Russia's possession and Putin's behavior, declarations, and capabilities." So besides its agreements with Washington, Japan now has 2+2s, that's defense and state, defense and foreign ministers meeting together bilaterally with 5 countries. It has acquisition and cross-servicing agreements, the AXAs, with 4 GSOMIAs, which are intelligence sharing agreements, with 7 countries, bilateral military training with 8 different countries, and has inked defense equipment transfer agreements with 5 different countries. And in recent years, there's been a noticeable increase in the exercises and port visits to Japan by countries that are not the United States of America. From Japan's perspective, this is designed to keep major states on side and neighbors on side vis-a-vis China, and to hedge against what the MOD think tank meaning NIDS, the National Institute for Defense Studies, openly has identified as the quote, likely shrinking of U.S. relative power in a multipolar order. Now, some initiatives are more robust, or more modest, I should say, than others, but there have been developments of note that have proceeded in parallel with a tightened hug of the United States. So I'll just quickly flick at them and I'll get out of your way. But the one that has attracted the most attention is the Quad, known as the Quad, which comprises the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, 4 countries that share concerns about and seek to counter China's assertive behavior in the Indo-Pacific. It's a vast area, of course, through which the world's exports and more than 1/3 of its global imports are transit. Now, this is not a NATO it's not a NATO mini-me by any extent, but Quad leaders do hold regularly scheduled strategic consultations and joint military exercises. It's the beginning of something bigger, it seems. Anyway, there are important bilateral initiatives as well. Last year, Tokyo and Canberra signed a reciprocal access agreement to establish the two countries' defense forces to cooperate with each other for the first time, enhanced partnerships with European states, including the Brits, who train annually now with the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force in Japan. Last year, Tokyo and London signed a reciprocal access agreement modeled on the one with Australia. And perhaps the biggest, and for U.S. defense contractors, the most unwelcome news was the agreement signed late last year by the UK, Italy, and Japan, all three partners in the Lockheed Martin F-35 program, to form a new partnership of equals, quote unquote, to develop a sixth-generation fighter platform for the Japanese. And for the first time, a Japanese combat plane will not be purchased, co-developed, or co-produced with the United States. Now, for its part, France has 2 million nationals and 8,000 military personnel in the Indo-Pacific, has strengthened its ties with Japan, and even Germany, which you wouldn't think of as having anything to defend necessarily out in the South China Sea and so forth. It has no Pacific territories in the south, down in the Philippine Sea. Anyway, it delighted many in Japan by sending a frigate to Northeast Asia and telling the press, this is the thing that really got people excited, wasn't the frigate. The frigate didn't impress many people, certainly not China, but that saying publicly that China cannot be allowed to impose their own order in the region. It's the Germans. And of course, none of these relationships compares to the US-Japanese or even to the Australia-Japanese security ties, but it's worth noting how security stopped being a third rail for aspiring Japanese leaders as China's power grew and as America's power has declined relatively. So let me end by returning to the liberal paradigm for a second and speak to the divisions within the Japanese strategic community regarding national security. Although his cabinet is responsible for the new NSS, as I've said, Prime Minister Kishida is not a military realist in the Abe mold. Indeed, we recall that he became prime minister over Abe's objections, opposition, and therefore felt it necessary as a matter of political logic. He can count faction numbers, and felt it necessary as a matter of political logic to accept a harder line NSS than he was usually associated with after he was considered dovish in the Yoshida, pragmatic in the Yoshida school. This was a struggle for him. For a time, he and his supporters took pains to remind voters that China was Japan's largest trading partner, and right after taking office in late 2021, Mr. Kishida declared his government would make an effort to stabilize relations with Beijing. Immediately stepping into office, he seized the opportunity to insert a more China moderate party chief and a more China moderate foreign minister who actually had chaired the China-Japan Parliamentary Friendship Committee for 4 years. That got people's attention. So it was a reminder in a way, but he still went along with a hardline NSS. So this is a reminder that a range of visions among Japanese strategists persists, even within the LDP. Now, the military realism that seems to have prevailed in the production of the new NSS remains one of only 4 grand strategic choices. And some of you will have heard me, I hope, or will have read that I've written about this in the past. I'll just very briefly flick. But these realists are the folks the realists are the folks who know they can't balance China alone, and while claiming to be all in with the United States, have been busy developing busy diversifying Japan's dependence on Washington. But there are also bandwagoners with China in Japan, mostly in the business community, who would prefer that Japan accommodate to Chinese power. And they see China as the new global leader, and U.S.'s time has passed. And their numbers have dwindled as China has overplayed its hand, frankly, in the region. But their view is not irrelevant. Just last fall, the vice chair of one of Japan's leading business associations, the Keizai Doyukai, some of you know this organization, made headlines. I'm going to read you a quote when he declared that over the course of history, the world's hegemon has changed from the Netherlands to Great Britain to the United States, and now China is up for the challenge. We're at a major turning point in world history. Japanese companies should not make a hasty decision to withdraw from China. It was a perfect reflection of this view that I'm trying to communicate to you. Now, a third strategic perspective is espoused by dual hedgers, people who want to have their cake and eat it too. Like Kishida, before he moved rightward, as a matter of political protection, as I've described it, to try to keep the military realists at arm's length. These folks think that neither all-in bandwagoning with China nor all-in dependence upon the United States, a U.S. which is in relative decline, are really in Japan's interests. So they would like to have it both ways. And finally, there are those who want Japan to keep its distance, a pox on both houses, keep its distance from both Washington and Beijing. They prefer autonomous defense and would like to have Japan use the U.S.-Japan alliance as a means to transcend the U.S.-Japan alliance. Now, like the bandwagoners, the autonomous fly beneath most radars. But if you want a taste, and I urge you to have a taste of the autonomy argument, I suggest you read the several daily tweets that are put out by Tamogami Toshio. You'll remember he was the former Air Self-Defense Force Chief of Staff who was fired in 2008 for insisting that Japan's aggression in Northeast and Southeast Asia in the 1930s and 40s was for a just cause. Now, his position was not marginal. It was certainly not what the Japanese government espoused was national policy. So he was fired, Kubi. He's gone. But he then ran for governor of Tokyo and got 16% of the vote. It's not a majority. It's not even close to, he couldn't form a government, but he got 16% of the vote. So this is a part of the Japanese security discourse we can't underestimate. The point is not only that diversity in Japanese strategic thinking, I should say, he tweets, I think I did say, he tweets all the time, have a look. It's very interesting stuff. And the point is not only that diversity in Japanese strategic thinking is alive and well, but also that each of these strategic choices requires Japan to get its relationship just right with Washington and Beijing. And that's what I've elsewhere called the Goldilocks challenge to Japan, to get it just right. And I'd be happy to explore that further in Q&A, but let me stop here. I've gone on too long. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, thank you, Professor Samuels, for a really interesting talk. It kind of struck me at a certain point when you were discussing Japan's extensions, looking for other partners in information collecting and perhaps defense services, the kind of complete lack of discussion of South Korea and how these changes over Taiwan have impacted the South Korean-Japanese relationship. And I was wondering if you could speak to that point.
No, it's great. And I just felt like I had to cut off something somewhere, and you nailed it. I did not talk about I talked about North Korea only in passing. And there's been the relationship between South Korea and Japan hit a new rock bottom over the last 5 to 7 years. It's never been so, I mean, it has been so bad, but a new post-1965 rock bottom. 65 was the normalization of relations and like that. And part of it is due to the fact that there are actors in both countries who are basically the skunks in the garden party. And any effort to have some level of reconciliation runs into these politicians, either ideological or electoral logics of using the other country, the right wing in Japan and the left wing in Korea as foils for their own base, and so there's that. There's the fact that well, you know, obviously the history issue, right? We call it, you're a historian, you know about this. The history issue has been used in that way in both countries. The Japanese by denying much of their history, and the South Koreans by inflating, in some cases, some of the history. But it's hard to inflate the violence that was brought to Korea by the Japanese. In any event, there was a lot wrong with the relationship, but so long as the Korean electorate sent a left-wing government to power and maintained a military realist government at home, it was a recipe for not disaster. Disaster is way too strong, but it was a recipe for significant deterioration in the relationship. And that's now changed with the election of President Yoon. And the willingness of a more moderate Kishida, more moderate than, say, Abe was on this issue, to try to find a solution. I think people give the United States credit for, you know, knocking heads together. We have two treaty allies out there. They don't get along with one another. They don't share intelligence with one another, and they have the same adversary in North Korea. I don't think that the United States deserves the credit that it's getting. I think the Korean electorate and the Japanese electorate deserve the credit for this. But we'll see how far it goes, because there are skunks at that garden party. I'm not sure if that gets, but there are many levels to the hostility between Korea and Japan. Some of them, again, rooted in history, but some are quite contemporary. Thanks. I mean, it was a great question. It's exactly what I didn't talk about.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Japan's plutonium stocks in terms of, I mean, this is really a break in the nuclear taboo in many ways that was taken without knowledge, perhaps, or the assent of the Japanese public. I was wondering where you see that sort of stockpile and desire to create a breakout capability started coming into place, especially since, you know, you think things like when the PRC tested its first nuclear device during the Tokyo Olympics. I mean, that became, you know, rather serious diplomatic crisis, right? So, you know, where do you see this kind of shift taking place over time?
It's another good question. We are seeing now there are two papers that I know of that have written by scholars who have gone into the archives and have found that there was an awareness of what was judged then and still is now to be the benefits of nuclear latency all the way back into the 1950s and 60s. And so the decision to go forward with nuclear power was a decision taken with the understanding that there would be a collateral benefit, which is a viable latency, viable nuclear hedge, so in the form of those plutonium stockpiles. So where are they? A lot of them went off to the French and the British and so forth for reprocessing and so forth. But you know, these were all, and some people say, well, it's in the possession of the Japanese nuclear power, the Japanese electric utilities, but a lot of it is not. And you know, Japan has worked very hard to establish itself as the paragon of disarmament, non-proliferation, and so forth. But it's you know, with apologies to those of you in Japanese who study Japanese fine arts, but it's a bit of a kabuki. When 3/11 happened, as I mentioned before, Morimoto-san, who was the DPJ's Minister of Defense, said, no, we need this stuff as a nuclear threat. Ishiba Shigeto, a former Minister of Defense, from the LDP likewise said, we need this. We must not stop nuclear power, and they campaigned very hard for this. Now, my favorite story on this, so the Japanese have kept the door wide open, just to be really clear, and have defended an open door for the basic reasons they think it's a deterrent, and it may well be, maybe. My favorite story about this was a story I read in a Japanese, actually it was an American magazine. I think it was Forbes or Fortune. It was a sort of a high-end business magazine, and it was an interview with an unnamed Japanese military official who was asked by the reporter, how long will it take Japan to become nuclear armed? How long would breakout actually take? And the reporter wrote that his interlocutor threw up his hands and said, we have absolutely no plans to do anything like that. But if we did, it would be 186 days. Exactly 6 months. And so, you have this, you have this option, and that's all it is right now. And actually fielding a nuclear weapon comes in many forms. And the German one we talked about still has the United States with its foot on the neck. But there are other options as well. The British option here, renting nuclear weapons, it's all sorts of things. And I think depending upon how well the United States does in convincing the Japanese not to be excessively concerned about its commitment and its capabilities going forward, you won't see much movement toward nuclear breakout in the near term. But in the mid and long term, I don't think they have much of an option, frankly.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is, how do you see the new Japanese defense posture jiving with its demographic transition that's taking place?
Very good. Good question. I'm going to go back to, everyone understand it's the demographic transition of Japan. It's a great question, and it's one you have to think about if you study this stuff. I'm going to go back to Tamogami. It's my favorite right-wing interlocutor, indirectly as it is. I've never met the man. He published some data yesterday, 2 days ago, from Dentsu. It's a major Japanese public relations company. And it reported that a little over 13% of Japanese were willing to fight in a war for Japan. And then he compared that to 80% of the Chinese who are willing to fight for China in a war. Now, not only is that an enormous gap in relative terms, but if you factor in the fact that Japan is, 120, 30 million now, and China is, God knows, 1.3, 4, huge. And so in absolute numbers, it's an extraordinarily large gap, demographic gap, of not just of young people, but of people willing to fight and die for their country. And they have no conscription. So I think, and they're leaving billets unfilled on a regular basis. They are just not filling their recruiting targets. Not by a long shot. There's maybe 100,000, 80 to 100,000. I think I'm making up those numbers, but I don't think I'm off by an order of magnitude. There's an enormous shortfall in recruitment. So I think it is a serious problem, and one way around that, of course, is to use military equipment that's not manned. And so, and the Japanese understand that, so they're buying more unmanned aerial vehicles, more missile systems, and so forth. But that's not going to get them where they want to go in a major conflict, especially if it's a conflict that involves the United States and the U.S. wants and needs boots on the ground, which is what Richard Armitage asked for the last time. But it's a good question. It's a real problem.
Yes, thank you, Professor Samuels, for sharing your insights with us. Prime Minister Kishida visited Kyiv recently when President Xi was in Moscow. That's a major signal, obviously. Is that something that may divert some resources from the Ukraine front to eastern Russia, or the Russians don't care at this stage?
I'm not sure I get, what is the Kishida visit?
Would Russia see this as a reason to divert resources from the Ukraine war, or it's not relevant?
I don't think so. I think what the Prime Minister was doing, and color me cynical, but he's got the G7 coming up, and he's chairing it, and it's in Japan, and he can't really have the authority he would otherwise have as chair of the G7 meeting if he didn't get to Kyiv, since every one of the other leaders did. And so I think that's the cynical part of me. I don't see a shift in the deployment of forces that results from any of this. In fact, I don't think he has the authorization and the political juice to make that happen yet. But I think he really was desperate to get over there before the G7 got started. It was clearly all politics on that one, I think. International politics. But he wants the Japanese people to understand he's a world leader too.
Thank you very much for this talk, Professor. I think you mentioned the number of 168 days to achieve a nuclear weapon for Japan. It's really a quick process, and I want to ask what will be the Chinese reaction to any signal from Japan to achieving a nuclear weapon? If any Japanese step to this direction will push China to a war in Taiwan?
Great question. First of all, I don't believe that the 186-day is a reliable number. It was the answer that was quoted. I think the Japanese have a lot to do, a lot in addition to do. But we don't know because so much of it is shrouded. So, okay. Let's say if it's not 6 months, it could be a year or year and a half. That's still very short. What would be the Chinese reaction? Predictably, very severe, I would think. Now the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean an attack, a preemptive attack? I don't think so, because Japan has a nuclear-armed treaty partner in the United States. So I don't imagine that there'd be a preemptive attack in the event that a nuclear program is unveiled. I'm sorry? Oh, an attack on Taiwan. And you're asking about whether the Japanese would use nuclear weapons in the event of it?
If China will want to attack Taiwan before the Japanese have the nuclear ability.
I see. No, I don't think so. I don't think that would do it, because I think the Chinese have a bigger adversary to contend with, and one more likely to get into a fight, and that's the United States. So I think the calculation on whether or not they do it before the Japanese can become a nuclear power is probably not high on the agenda. Yeah, I see the question now. Good.
Thanks so much for the very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more about how Japan is going to pay for doubling the defense budget. I thought it was really interesting. I hadn't heard about. Now we can count the Japan Coast Guard as part of the defense budget. That gets us part of the way there. I'm wondering about what your thoughts about how they get the rest of the way there. But also I'm wondering how much you see the success of pledges like this, or the NSS more generally, as tied to the fate of Kishida. So Kishida doesn't seem like particularly popular. The policies might be popular, but he's not necessarily that popular with the public right now. Do you see these policies as popular enough within the public and the LDP that even if Kishida were to say, not last long enough to implement them, they'll probably go on without him? Or I'm just curious how much you see it as tied to Kishida's own political future.
Yeah, and I think actually Kishida has been bold on this one in a way that I wouldn't have expected, in the sense that he's been in favor of tax increase, whereas others have said, nah, let's sell bonds. We'll make the children and grandchildren and foreigners pay for this, I think. But he went for the tax increase, but he's not got the support that he needs. He's not got the support he needs for that. So how do you get there? Well, it's not just the Coast Guard, remember. It's also any government funding for dual use technologies, and that that's a big tent. That's a huge tent, because almost everything is a dual use technology according to its proponents. It's the people who are looking for the funding, right? So it's dual use. And it would be interesting to actually do some at least back of the envelope calculations on how far that gets them. But it's clearly not far enough, because they're still talking about tax and bonds. And there may be perhaps some agreement reached, some kind of a negotiated settlement reached between the advocates for each, but I sort of doubt it. The LDP has had nothing but, as you know, Charlie, the LDP has had nothing but trouble. Every time it raises taxes, it gets hammered by voters, hammered. And so it's not only they don't want to fight and die for their country, they don't want to pay taxes either. They already do pay a lot of taxes. They don't want to pay more taxes. So I think he's in a bind. But I got the impression that his popularity has improved in the last 3 weeks. And I think getting over to Kyiv, back to that question from the gentleman up here, getting to Kyiv and demonstrating leadership of this sort will further reinforce and maybe even lead to an early dissolution of Diet and a re-election. So that's my guess, is the calculation there. Yeah.
Am I able to, can I ask?
There you are.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and I was trying to think of a brave question, but I'm a comparativist. I'm going to ask about voters, and this is actually a perfect follow-up, I think, to Charlie's question, because I was also interested in the payment for these new programs, or for the expansion of the defense budget. And I know the IR scholars are interested in what sinks battleships, and we're interested in what sinks the LDP. And so I'm curious, right? If the current trend among Japanese leaders is realist, can we construe public opinion? Can we construe the voters as well as realists, or merely realist accommodating for now? And that is to say, when push comes to shove, is everybody a realist until they come for your pension?
It's like everyone's a liberal until they get mugged, right? Right. Okay. I don't know the answer to that, except to report to you something you already know, Colin, which is that I keep doing that the Japanese voters now report support. They're not just accommodating to Abe; they're actually supporting military realist programs and postures. It seems to me a real shift, that the center of gravity has moved in Japanese public opinion. And that it's a real thing, but it's also true in the United States that everybody is, let's go fight this war. We do this all the time until it's your children or your neighbor's children, and then you're not so enthusiastic anymore, right? So, or you shouldn't be anyway. I think that I think it's a real change, I guess, is the bottom line. It's substantive, it's real, it's calculable, and I think sustainable. China's just been, as I said, overplaying its hand. China could have achieved so much more by not being as provocative as it's been in the region. Now, during the Abe administration, Abe goes to Beijing and he talks to Xi Jinping, and they work out a whole list of economic agreements. This is October now of 2018, I think, right? And they work out a whole set of agreements, and it looked like, that Abe had moved to the center from the right. As it turned out, nothing ever took place, nothing ever happened. It was all for show. And so the reality is everyone has moved to the right in Japan.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. So my question is so you mentioned how the overall business sector of Japan right now favors increasing big trade interactions with China. And I want to know how, to what extent it represents the sentiment, the concept, the perception of the general public, the small business owners, especially tourism, or it represents the willingness of the elite class, the big companies, and to what extent can this business-oriented sentiment impact the policymaking of the Japanese government?
Yeah. I think business is more divided. What I was trying to get at was that there is a part of business, like the Keizai Doyukai spokesperson, who sees China as the future and so forth. But I think business is quite divided on China. There are those who are dependent upon imports from China, like rare earth metals, for example, who were denied access to them and then had to hustle to find alternative sourcing and so forth due to bilateral political disputes, right? So you have, in a sense, the Japanese business community is split between those who built big factories in China and want them to succeed, enormous capital investments, and those who are trying to extract certain raw materials. The people who are at the top of the value-added chain will not necessarily have the same set of interests vis-a-vis trade with China as the bottom of the value-added chain. I only offered the example I offered to illustrate one particular corner of the security discourse. I don't think it represented all of Japanese business. It represented those who really see it as China as the future, but that's not everyone.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I have a question about the underlying causes of the change of public opinion about the military policies, because it seems, at least to me, that the reason for the change is not limited to how the Japanese right-wing politicians emphasize the China threat discourse, but also it can be attributed to the loss of public resonance of once bold pacifist movement. So I would like to ask, for what reason the Japanese pacifist activists came to lose the public resonance that they once had?
Well, I think that, as I said in my remarks, there were three reasons. One was that for many Japanese citizens, they recognized that China was a security threat to Japan, that they came to see it as Abe was painting it, and the Abe group, the military realists that I described. And so they understood that. That's kind of a highfalutin view, because not everybody in the Japanese public sees things in these kinds of strategic terms. But there are the three strategic reasons. One is that North Korea, it's throwing hardware over the archipelago and nuclear missiles. It's been doing it for 10, 12 years now. And it's very provocative. And so they see that as a threat. So North Korea is a threat. They see China as a threat. And there's a lot of fuss over the strategic importance of a very unstrategic bit of land, which is the Senkakus. Senkaku Islands are inside the first island chain. If the Chinese get the Senkaku Islands, they still can't get out of the first island chain. Like if they get Taiwan, all bets are off. Then they're out into the Philippine Sea. But so it's the threat from China as they see it, the threat from North Korea as they see it, and as I say, the demonstrable threat of the Americans not caring much. President Trump made it very clear, within a week after his inauguration, he bailed out on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and what did we get this week? The British joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They left Brexit, they left the EU, and they joined the Trans-Pacific, much bigger market. And the Americans are left out in the cold to these bilateral FTAs and so forth. So anyway, the point is the Americans in the Trump administration, there was the dropping of the TPP, which, for domestic political reasons, which we can talk about, number one. The demands that host nation support be doubled, tripled, and really telling the Japanese that they're only good for, that we're only there to be mercenaries, and we'll fight for you, but you got to pay us a lot more money. He just didn't understand the strategic issues, didn't care, and he was doing that. And of course, after his first visit to Korea, he was North Korea, visit with, I should say, Kim Jong-un, I guess in Singapore that summer. He made it very clear that the United States didn't care about medium-range nuclear weapons. They cared about intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so the result was, and he said it out loud. Well, of course, if you're Japanese, you care about both, or you should, and you feel quite abandoned by the United States when you get a president of the United States saying such things. So those are the three strategic reasons, and I think they just have been fed a steady diet of news about the Senkaku. I mean, those poor goats on the Senkaku Islands. There's a lot of goats there, but that's about it. Anyway, they're fed a steady diet about imminent aggression, and some of it sticks. So some of it, as we've seen in the United States, there's some of the most outrageous and outlandish things stick, and you got to deal with it politically at home.
Thank you for the interesting talk. So I have a question. I'm curious to know the role of electoral competition in determining foreign policy in Japan. So maybe I missed it in the talk, but are there any factions in LDP, and do different parties have different stance on this, on China threat and on foreign policy in general?
Yes, the answer is yes and yes. The LDP, since its initiation in the 1950s, has been split between a nationalist wing. In the book, I called them the revisionist wing, but it's they wanted to revise the Constitution, but it's really I should have called it the nationalist wing, which was Kishi Nobusuke, Abe's grandfather, and Nakasone Yasuhiro, and those guys. And the pragmatists under Yoshida Shigeru and his followers. And there was the pragmatists were they were pragmatic, and they didn't do things to inflame the bilateral relationships in foreign policy in the way that the nationalists would. And in fact, it's curious because from an American perspective, it seemed that there was no better friend of the United States than Kishi Nobusuke, which is very, very ironic, since he was an unindicted war criminal, spent time in Sugamo prison. He was Abe's grandfather, and but he was anti-communist. That was good enough for us during the Cold War. So there are those two big groups. Now there are factions which are not all policy defined. There's leadership, and so for example, you get someone like Aso, former prime minister and former deputy prime minister and so forth. He's got all sorts of people in his faction. They're not all military realists. And, and those factions matter, and we saw how much they mattered when Abe ordered his faction, or signaled to his faction that it should not support Kishida. And he had to cobble together support from the rest of the factions to become president of the party and then prime minister. So these things do matter. And the Kishida folks, as I described them in my remarks, are these dual hedgers who would like to have it both ways. They think that they can. So Kishida comes out of that Yoshida school and is identified with a much more moderate approach to China over the last, say, he was foreign minister, you know. So while he was foreign minister, it was a much more deliberate, pragmatic approach, which I don't think it didn't transform Chinese behavior. And as I say, I think to the Chinese, I've said it several times already, I won't repeat it, but they miscalculated.
Please join with me in thanking Professor Samuels for his grim but enlightening talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.